Well, I'm a hydrogeologist. I've been practicing for over 30 years. Before I became a hydrogeologist, I was a contractor in building single-family homes in Pennsylvania, and then I had a degree in chemistry, but hated chemistry. Hated the job of chemistry, and I liked studying chemistry. So I came from a construction background, so I started in construction. And then I ended up one day in the Grand Canyon and said, geez, I should study geology. And so that's what I did. And geology is the study of earth processes, and earth processes are what control your aquifers, all aquifers. And the earth process that created and controls your aquifer is glaciation. It's hard to imagine, but more than about 13,000 years ago. So to put it in perspective, like the first pyramids, the first Egyptian dynasty was 6,000 years ago. Right? Stonehenge was built after that. So about 6,000 years before the pyramids were built, where you are sitting, you would be under about a mile of ice. And the ice flowed out of the Hudson Bay, which is way up there, and that was called a dome, an ice dome. And although ice is solid, it's deformable, and over long periods of time it flowed and came over us and went all the way down to Pennsylvania and stopped at about 21,000 years ago. That's known as the last glacial maximum, and then it started retreating. And that was the beginning of the warming that we're still in today. And about 12,000 years ago, it passed, the front of the ice passed right where we're standing. The bulk of it was still hitting the bottom in Lake Ontario Basin, and it was melting enormous amounts of water. And that water was coming off of the glacier, but also going down through the glacier and coming up like a fountain underneath it, right up where we're standing. Okay? And along that fountain carried along that fountain was large pieces of gravel and rocks. Okay? And it's those gravels and rocks that make the best aquifers. Okay? So the aquifers in Sterling, the town of Sterling, especially along the lakefront, are made of these sand and gravel, and sometimes they say cobbles, which is a big rock, that were pushed out of the glacier. Okay? So conceptually that's a lot to get your head around, so I'm going to draw a little picture of your shoreline. And then the ice came in and it eroded out Sodas Bay. Okay, so now the ice front is sitting right, different color for you. So this is north, is up the page. There's Sodas Bay, and we're sitting right about here. The ice front was right about here. There we go. Did everybody watch Game of Thrones? No? Oh, well, there's a big wall that holds off the Northland. It's about 1,000 feet high. That's what it would have looked like. You would have seen a wall of ice, because the ice, unlike what you see in pictures today of the glaciers melting in Glacier National Park, and you see a little white thing kind of going up the valley, that's a valley glacier. We had a continental glacier, and its base got lubricated every time it came down across Lake Ontario, because that was a big depression and it would fill with water whenever the ice wasn't there. So the ice would scream across Lake Ontario, and you'd have this giant wall of ice, okay? And then it would run into land over here. And this is what it would look like. So this is where we are at Town Hall. And there's Lake Ontario. Sorry, here's Lake Ontario. And then the ice underneath it would form meltwater channels. And the way to think of it, this is a cross section through the ice, okay? So here I am, standing out in front of it, right? And the sun hits the ice and it starts to melt, and you get little pools. And eventually it trickles down all the way through the bottom. When it gets to the bottom, downhill is to the south, and it runs out the bottom like this. So if you stood in front of that wall of ice, coming out at your feet would be fountains of water, carrying lots of sand and gravel, okay? And the retreat from here is called a nervous ice front. And what happened was, it would come down and it would collide here, and then the ice that came into Lake Ontario would be cut off from the ice in Ontario, and this would melt down and drain out the St. Lawrence River or through Chicago and down the Mississippi. And then the ice up in Ontario will creep out, start floating on the water, and then surge across again. And so it just kept slamming in to right where we are. And every time it came in, it pushed sand and gravel and dirt in front of it. Then it melted down by pushing water out of the bottom. And so that's how your aquifers form here. Now, we'll go back to this map, I'll take the ice off. Try to draw your little aquifer. So here at the Y, see how this isn't, that's over here now. So right here at the Y, the town and Fairhaven have two wells right there. Right north is up the page. Is everybody, are you oriented?
Yeah.
Okay, and this is Lake Ontario. And so, when the soul of the glacier, the base of the glacier gets lubricated from meltwater going through it, it races, it surges. And as it surges, it creates features in the surface that look like elongated troughs, and they're drumlins. And so you've all seen the drumlin fields here, and they're all oriented, they're all oriented north-south, right? They are actually what's left of the ice as it melted. So as the water came through, the water is above the temperature of freezing, and it carves a hole up into the ice and charges through it and deposits sand and gravel. And then winter comes, the ice sits down and compresses it. Next season it melts again. And what you see here are like the remnants of one of the last times the ice surged forward. Okay, so in between these drumlins, you had these jets of water coming out from under the ice. And beginning at 104A, so we're at 104A and I'm looking east, the water wells are on my right, wetland on my left, right? A little bit further beyond the wetland, from there all the way up to Simmons Road was a Niagara Falls of water coming up and bubbling up on the ground and then flowing down to the south. And it did this probably a couple of times. Once a glacier meltwater channel has found the route of least resistance, it'll do it again and again. So we may have just one season's worth of meltwater in that channel, but there could be multiple seasons. And so up here in the ice, you have a pond, the water's coming down, going underneath the glacial ice. It's slamming into the ridge here, and then it's coming up. And so what got deposited, something like that, where if this is like Simmons Road, And this is 95 going by. I don't know what you call it. You gonna call it 95?
I don't, does anybody else know?
I know all roads have names, but when you bring them up in Google Earth, they have numbers. Yeah. Well, anyway, you probably know about this little triangle. There's something else that comes through here. And then there's a gravel pit here, there's a gravel pit there, and there's a gravel pit there. So this deposit, this gusher of water came up and deposited up here, and then the ice retreated one of the last times. A shoreline was created on the slope, and you had what was known as Lake Iroquois. Anybody ever hear Lake Iroquois? No. So glacial Lake Iroquois persisted in Lake Ontario. It's the lake that was there before Lake Ontario, and it lasted for about 2,000 years. Okay, and it drained down the Mohawk River with the drainage point at Little Falls. So at the elevation of Little Falls, once the lake got below the level of the elevation of Little Falls, it drained to the north up throughout the St. Lawrence River. But during that 2,000 years, the ice sat up above Henderson, and blocked the St. Lawrence River. So all the water that was melting couldn't go up the St. Lawrence Seaway and out into the bay there, the St. Lawrence Gulf, the St. Lawrence Gulf. It all had to go south. It shortcutted through Little Falls and down through the Mohawk and down the Hudson. And then when it would retreat and shut that off, it would go west through the Waverly channels, Lake Erie, and then down the Mississippi, eventually making its way down the Mississippi. So for about 2,000 years, there was a lake before Lake Ontario called Lake Iroquois. And if you look at the maps, you can see the shoreline. You see roads follow them. 104 pretty much follows that shoreline. And if you get off the road, you get on the side of the road, you start digging pits, you'll actually see sand dipping back into the lake, just like if you went to the beach. And you know how beaches just gently slope back. And that, if you dig a hole, you'll see that sand is layers. You know, if you're in New Jersey or Long Island, it's like a gray and a dark layer of gray. And that's dipping, that tells you where the water is. In Lake Ontario and glacial Lake Iroquois, they all dip back up to the north. Well, the ice finally pulled off of the Duck Below Sill, as you remember, and water drained to the north, and Lake Iroquois drained, and we have Lake Ontario. Before it left, though, it abandoned this sand and gravel deposit right here. That sand and gravel deposit is where you drill, that's where you get your water from. Okay. But glacial Lake Iroquois came right about through the middle, and it deposited silt and clay over this part of the aquifer. And actually, one of your wells goes through clay, the other one doesn't go through as much. So, that part of that aquifer is now buried down below clay. So to the north, on the north side of 104A and a little bit towards your wells, all that sand and gravel is covered with clay that was deposited in glacial Lake Iroquois. From your wells to the south and up, that sand is exposed right at the surface. It's really well-drained soil. It's where you put pines, it's where you put a cemetery, where you put a sand and gravel quarry. And these are things geologists look for. Whenever I see a cemetery, I say, that's sand. Because nobody buries their loved one in not well-drained soil. Pines like well-drained soil, and gravel quarries are always in these. And so, the area encompassed by this sand and gravel deposit, I don't know what's underneath it. I really don't know what's on the sides of it. But I know what's on top of it because we've drilled some holes. And that is like a sponge that is your water storage. Okay, it's defined aerially, you know, as we look down, it's defined as this, it's almost a delta shape, right? Presumably it has sides that come down, I don't know if it's rock or whether it's other material, and then it terminates at a point where it's the deepest. Because this water that comes out of a glacier and digs a hole, makes the same kind of hole that you would make if you had your hose on high velocity and you laid it down into your lawn. And it would make a long hole and then just come up abruptly at the end, right? So I would imagine that aquifer would be shallowest here, getting deeper, and then an abrupt wall that comes up at the other end. So it's kind of pie-shaped, thinner at the north, and thicker in the middle and the most, and then shallow as it comes up. So I'm trying to give you the shape. This is aquifers in this type of environment where they're surrounded by clay or lake deposits. They're actually buckets, right? They have defined sides, and they have recharge areas where water can go in, and it's held in there like a sponge, and then you put a well in and you pull it out. And the sponge metaphor is important to keep because if you put a pump into a bucket, right, you can pump that as fast as you want and draw that bucket down. But if that bucket was filled with sponge, right, you wouldn't be able to pump it at full speed because it's got to drain through all the little nooks and crannies that are in there to get to your pump. So that material that's in the aquifer, in this case sand and gravel, in my bucket, a sponge, that limits how fast you can pump the water back out, because the water has to get to your pump. If there's no sponge in there at all, you can pump it as fast as you want. If there's a sponge in there, it can only get there to your pump as fast as it can go through all the little crooks and nannies to get there. That's called tortuosity. Without the sponge there, there's just a straight line to your pump. With the sponge there, the water's got to go like this, so there's a longer path. And that's what limits how much water you can pull out of an aquifer, is the matrix. It's the shape of your sponge, it's the kind of sponge. If you have a really cheap sponge with giant holes in it, you'll get water out of it really fast. If you put, Mr. Wizard's, those really fine white sponges that take anything off of anything, right? You'd struggle to pull water through that because the pores are all so small. So I would liken your aquifer here and all the aquifers along Lake Ontario and to the south to some distance. I don't know, but I would extend it beyond Sterling. All the aquifers are limited in size, and they're made of sand and gravel. And when you pull water from them, you're pulling water through a matrix. And I'll talk now about the qualities of a matrix, of what that matrix is. It's what it's made of that makes all the difference in the world. So I'm going to draw a hypothetical well into the ground. The distance can be anything. At some point, you'll hit the water table, okay? And the water table is defined as the top of the groundwater, okay? So there's soil here, and you could have the same soil here, but the water table is the depth where the soil is saturated with water, where your sponge is now saturated, okay? In a typical well, I'm going to put down here just a theoretical bottom, and we'll call it bedrock because that's what I think you're dealing with. And once went to a timeshare presentation and the person could write upside down faster than they could write not
I
upside
wanted to
down.
make sure
It's
I could
amazing.
see the white.
And so you put a well in there, and then when you hit, at some point below the water table, you take your pipe
It is filling.
and you cut little slots into it, and that's called a well screen. And the size of the slots is determined by the size of the matrix. If you have really thick boulders the size of my hand, you could put a slot this wide, right? But if you had little sand particles, you might want really narrow slots. And it's designed to hold the matrix back, but allow the water to come in, okay? And then up here, we put a pump, and it can be any sort of a pump, and it spits the water out, it pumps the water down, and as it starts to pump the water down, in the subsurface, it creates a thing called a cone of depression. Okay. And it's real. Like if I pump this well and I put in another well here and I watched, I would actually see lower water level. The water level would be here in this well. And the best way to imagine it is you have a big old, we used to call them stationary tubs when I was a kid, now they're called utility sinks. But if you have a giant utility sink with a good old white old plunger in it, fill it up a couple feet of water and then pull that plunger out. And it'll start going down, and then a little bit of time in the northern hemisphere, it'll start circling to the right. And then you'll see a hole where you can actually look almost right into the drain, right? Well, that's the cone of depression. That's what you're seeing. Except instead of pulling the plug here, we're just pumping the water up with a pump. But it's generating the same effect, okay? And so this is your cone of depression. The matrix in here, right, it's still sand and gravel, but it's dry. All the water has drained out of it, okay? And the water that is drained out is the water that's come up and we've pumped out. Now, over a long period of time, what will happen is, over a long period of time, depending on the matrix, whether it's fine-grained or coarse-grained, whether you're pumping hard or soft, the cone of depression will flatten way out. Okay. Went too far over there. Okay. And so the cone of depression, it can't get any deeper because that's where the pump is. But we're using the water, so we have to drain more of the matrix. So we have to now drain all this area here. Okay? If we pump at the same rate for a long period of time, we'll eventually reach a point where the rain that's coming out of thunderstorms, percolating down to the aquifer and recharging the aquifer, will eventually reach a point where the amount of water going in is equal to the amount of water pumped out, and you'll have a stable drawdown curve or cone of depression. Imagine that sink, it's spinning down, and then you get a garden hose, and now you're feeding it, and you turn it up or down just to hold the water level perfect, right? And that state of equilibrium nobody can ever achieve, but there is a theoretical state of equilibrium that you can calculate, and that is called your safe yield. That's the amount of water you can take out without hurting the aquifer. Okay. And the safe yield is determined by how much water comes down. In our case, it's almost all snow, so we get 36 inches of precipitation here, and I think 3/5 maybe comes from snow. And so the aquifers are recharged in the spring. Water tables are the highest in the spring. In the fall, even though we get big thunderstorms, and this year has been really anomalous. This is one of the wettest summers I can remember. But usually summers aren't this wet, and in the fall your water tables are the lowest. But if you were pumping at a constant rate, and we got precipitation, 38 inches a year, same amount of recharge, there's a theoretical point that you could achieve where the aquifer was being recharged at the same rate that water was going into it. hydrogeologist can calculate that. And I'm not gonna go into calculations, but you'll hear the word maximum safe yield. That means you can take this much out without damaging the aquifer. And you can damage aquifers. It's rarely does it happen, but theoretically you could pump this out so much that the grains in there that were a little bit suspended by the presence of the water could start to collapse together, right, and compress tighter, and now they won't hold as much water. If you pump for a real long time, let's say, and you have trucks driving by, lots of trucks all the time, shaking the ground, and this used to be, it's called dispersion, the force, it's called a dispersive force. So for every force, there's an equal and opposite force. With the water not there, you don't have the water pushing against it. Even though it can't float, the water's still pushing against it. You can have it settle, and now your aquifer won't hold as much water, and over time you'll find that you have to draw it down further and further. Very unusual event, but it does happen. I only bring it up to, just to demonstrate that some aquifers are frail. They can be frail. The most frail aquifers are aquifers that are limited in size, as this one is, and are overpumped. Either overpumped or the recharge area is removed. And we remove recharge area by putting down parking lots, by spreading out clay for whatever reason, changing farming techniques, deforestation. Forests hold water back and prevent runoff, and it tends to pool around their roots, so you have a greater recharge in forested areas than you do in open fields. So these parameters all change, but we're aware of them, and in order to protect aquifers, there's a thing called a source water protection plan. It used to be called wellhead protection plan, that morphed into source water protection. And what the source water protection plan does is it allows the hydrogeologist to calculate the maximum safe yield, and then based on good pumping test data, that hydrogeologist can tell you where the water's coming from, where the recharge is coming from, and then you can put watershed limitations to how that land is used or how it can be used to protect your source area. It used to be a 3-zone system, and it was the wellhead zone, which was a 30-foot diameter around the wellhead, and then there was an automatic 50-foot, and then there was called the capture zone, which was any place on the watershed that you could pool water to. And we used to run a program called Flow Path, and it would map all those arrows of where the water came from, and then you would just circle it and say there's your recharge zone. So that's the basics of how aquifers work. It's really magic, but
So, sorry.
sure, no, yeah.
So the recharge thing, is that specifically just from rain and snow, or is that how it gets there, or could there be springs, underwater springs that are feeding into it? I don't know.
No, so
You said
no,
that,
that's a very good question. So that's not your scenario here, but you could have a scenario where an aquifer, right here, the recharge area could be miles away. Because in the subsurface, there's a buried conduit. It could be a porous matrix, like sand and gravel, or it could be a fracture in the rock, or it could be karst, which is limestone, corrosion, caves, a cave system. So you could have a source area that's far away. That is usually associated with bedrock wells. This is an unconsolidated or sand and gravel. They come in 2 flavors. Some wells are completed in bedrock. So let's say there wasn't any water here. We drilled down, we didn't find any water, and we hit bedrock right there, right? And this was just silt and clay all the way down. It's not going to make any water. We could drill into bedrock And eventually we would hit fracture planes like this, and water would come in through those fracture planes, right? We know the water didn't come in from here because this is all silt and clay. So the water in those fractures must be coming from someplace else. That's about the only situation where you have something like that. Most sand and gravel aquifers recharge proximal or pretty close to it.
So the only recharge that we receive is from the environment. From
Yes.
rain and snow.
From snow and rain water, yeah. About, geez, I used to know these things automatically, but actually climate change is changing a lot of them. But we used to get about a third of the precipitation for the year would be absorbed into the ground. So 10, 12 inches, right? Something like that, of water would be held in the ground. Now, not all of it would make it that year down to the water table. It actually may take, depending on the soil, it could take a while to migrate down. You need pressure on top of it to keep pushing it in some instances. But yes, so recharge to a sand and gravel, a localized sand and gravel aquifer, like all these aquifers around here, is recharged from local precipitation.
You said all these aquifers around here.
Yes.
Just to put a perspective on ours there, if you look, like if you took from, maybe Oswego to Rochester, is that a common one? Is there like,
Yeah,
would you say 50 in
thousands.
that?
Thousands.
Oh,
Now,
okay,
some of them might not be large enough to support the amount of water that you're drawing,
yep,
but there will be thousands of isolated sand and gravel aquifers all the way along. You've been to Chimney Bluff, and it's all sand and gravel. That was one of these large, in this case it was a tunnel valley, a much larger structure than we're talking about here. But that was one giant large tunnel valley that threw that sand and gravel up there. So some of the aquifers are quite large, but many are smaller, and yours would be about medium average size. So there would be many this size aquifer right here in the town of Sterling, but you would find them all across what we call the Ontario lowland. So from Syracuse, where the Onondaga limestone is, right? From there to Lake Ontario is called the Ontario lowland. Okay, and yeah, there would be literally thousands. And-
Someone's drilling a well on their piece of property
Mhm.
and hit water. Are they just getting groundwater, or is it a mini aquifer, or are they just having to be, you're getting dry holes and, how does it just an individual homeowner who used to 100 years ago drill a well, dig a well?
Yeah, so
What were they getting?
so 100 years ago, they were drilling. 200 years ago, they were digging.
Dig, okay.
And they would dig next to a swamp, they would dig next to a creek, or dig next to a stream or river. And because all streams, swamps, wetlands, they are outcrops of groundwater. That's where the water that's in the ground is intersecting the ground surface. So if you live up on the hill here, and you may have dug a pond in your wetland down below, next to your house, if you dig down to the elevation of that wetland, you'll be in water. And that's what they did with dug wells, 200 years ago. They would do the same thing now, 100 years ago with a different technology than we have now, but yeah.
But it's getting groundwater as opposed to a pool of water. An aquifer might be a pool of water, but there's always groundwater everywhere.
Yes. Even the silt and clay is full of water. You just can't get it out at a rate fast enough to use it.
But if you're an individual homeowner, you can maybe get out of your.
But what you will find, and so there are literally thousands of permutations of types of aquifer like this. So you could drill down 5 feet and hit water and say, wow, we're in water, and you have a nice white grayish sand coming up, and you say, well, we need 10 feet in order to get enough water, and you get to 8 feet and poof, you're out of it, now you're back into clay again. And that's called a perched aquifer or perched groundwater. And you could get water out of there if you hadn't gone through it. It wouldn't last long. You know, usually those perched zones are very limited in scope or extent. But they do exist. What we're talking about here, this aquifer is, I believe, probably interconnected in some way with the other aquifers. We don't know what it really looks like underneath there. But there is some degree of interconnection, because during the flooding events, it wasn't just one tunnel. The whole front of the ice sheet was flooding. And so there, if you look at Steve Winkley's aquifer map, for instance, you can see how they all look like they kind of interconnect. It's almost like they're braided, right? And so to some extent, they are interconnected, but for the scope of extracting groundwater for domestic supply, probably not enough interconnection to consider them one large aquifer. You have to find different areas where the sand and gravel is very thick, has good recharge, and find another area.
How do you determine the size of that aquifer? I mean, you call it a big, relatively small one or medium one.
Yeah. So a big one is the Cortland aquifer, and it starts about Tully on Route 81, and it goes all the way down almost to Kirkville, and then it goes out Route 88 over to almost to Sarah, Pennsylvania. It's a huge aquifer, and it has special protections. It's considered a primary aquifer. That's a large one. If you get out west in the Ogallala aquifer, it goes from Canada to Texas, from Denver to the Mississippi River. And these are giant sand and gravel deposits that were put there during the glacial period. And they have wells out there that pump thousands of gallons per minute.
So how do you determine the size? Is it like sonar or?
Right. So it's very expensive to do geophysical tests. You could use sound, you could use resistivity. The best way to get at it is drilling a hole and seeing what you got. And then, I would say in my mind, the hole should be randomly placed, but in your case, you know so much about this aquifer. You could pick the holes that you need, because there are already some wells in it. And Winkley and Andrew Kozlowski and Brian Bird, they did a very good job of mapping the aquifers here. But you would put in borings, and you try to hit that same layer. You would complete them as monitoring wells, and then you would go back to your pumping well, and you would determine, you do what's called a step drawdown test, where you pump the well harder and harder for short periods of time until it's not drawing down and it's not coming up. Like if I put a pump into a well and I pump it at 300 gallons per minute, if it can't handle that 300 gallons per minute in a very short time, the pump will be sucking air, right? That's bad for the pump, it's bad for the aquifer. So what you do is you put the pump in and you pump at 50 gallons per minute, and you only get a couple inches of drawdown. So you pump it at 100, right? And eventually you can get to a point where you say, this is an approximation of the maximum yield from this well. And then you do that, you turn that pump on at that rate for 3 days. And you have monitoring wells in the boreholes that you drilled, and you monitor the water level, okay? So if the water is coming to the well you're pumping from over here, that well will go down faster than the well over here. If it's coming from the well over here, that one will go down. And you map, you do it for 3 days, you run data loggers that take a reading every minute or 2 minutes. And as the water pumps and the water table goes down, the water will not be accessing as large an area if it's triangular shaped, right? Because there's more water, because it's wider at the top. It's like, we talk about, everybody's seen the pictures of Lake Mead and Lake Powell, and they say you know, there's 30% left, but if you look in there, you know, it looks like it's down at the bottom. That's because all the storage is in the upper part because it's so much wider. The same thing's true with most of these aquifers. So as that water goes down, if a part of the aquifer that was feeding a lot of water to the pump is now cut off because the water table's gone down, right? Well, then you'll see in your pumping well, you'll see it, the water level step down. And that's called hitting a no-flow boundary. And you can map out these, as you do the test, you'll see these things happening. You're observing water all throughout the aquifer, and you'll be able to map where your no-flow boundaries are, and that's the edge of your aquifer. And there's a lot of intuition, there's a lot of mathematics, and you can come up with a pretty good model. I can't say it's reality, but you have a model of what the aquifer looks like.
You see, that's expensive to do. Or,
Well, it's required by the state
okay.
for every public water supply serving more than a certain.
I didn't know if you meant that that was expensive to do, or the sonar, or whatever it was.
Yeah, I think the solenoid would be there.
Yeah, well, to do it at the level, so you would get more information from that test than the electrical resistivity that was done by somebody, which they did a very good job of it. You can use sound, you can do radar, but radar sound, when it hits the water table, it just, I call it, just goes blotto. It just disperses it all out. But you could do something called borehole tomography, where you put two boreholes in, and then you put sound sources in one and earphones in the other, and you send sound across. And it's just like what you get like in your MRI machine. You'll be able to create a cross-section of what it looks like, and that is very expensive.
But didn't you tell us that you would recommend locations of test wells?
Oh, definitely, yeah. So, when I look at your aquifer, Fairhaven aquifer, the only data we have is really sketchy from work that was done that wasn't directed by engineers. You know, Lane is a good company, Kincaid, they're good well drillers, but they don't collect the same kinds of data that a hydrogeologist or an engineer would collect. And so the only data we really have are some sketches, and then what the work of Steve Winkley, where he went around and literally knocked on people's doors and asked them how deep their wells were and so forth. And they're next to the road. Everybody, you know, and where you need the wells to define the aquifer, there aren't any wells. So you would need to put in some wells. And if you follow the DEC protocol, it requires a certain number of wells. And if you put them in the right place, I think you could define the limits of the aquifer. Yeah.
I've gotten a note, nobody can see this, but I'm not sure, have you seen, this is a draft that Steve did, in, 16, I have it February 10th, 16, of, like, could you look at this and explain this to us?
Sure. I don't think I've seen that.
Okay, well, it was really nice stuff.
I've seen that one.
And this is that one, yep, we have that, and with all the different, but as I look at this, of course, I'm not a hydrogeologist, but this was an aquifer protection overlay district, never, it's a draft.
Right.
So, that's what I am interested in, is the perceived overlay district, where you've got anything that could affect this, so does that,
Yeah.
I mean, does that look
I
like
have that page just for a
this,
minute.
this one, yeah?
Yeah, that was one of the handouts. I'm gonna show it to everybody. So this is a map of the aquifers in Sterling. that was created by Steve Winkley. And you can see what I mean by it almost looks braided. Okay, so the pink and the gray are both aquifers. The pink are where the aquifer is exposed at the surface, and the gray is where the aquifer is covered by silt and clay.
That's the same thing that's on the wall there?
No,
No, that's Todd
that's the
Miller's.
major
Major
aquifers.
aquifer.
Yeah, this is Todd Miller's work. He's an excellent hydrogeologist. And it was 1987, and we didn't have the drinking water database at the time. So right now, all new wells that go in New York State for the last probably close to 20 years go into a centralized database. You can go there, look them up, look at their depth, whether they went through sand and gravel, whether they hit bedrock, etc. In 1987, he didn't have that. And so I bet you if we put this on top of it, parts of this would match up with what he saw. But he just didn't have the database density to do what Steve did. And so I love how this just looks all braided, because that's what the system would have looked like. It's called braided outwash.
Sue, can I just confirm, that's in our land use regulation, correct? So if
Right,
someone
right.
says, oh, I want a copy of that, you can
Yes.
go
Yeah.
online.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's
To
been
be
well
able to pull up
vetted
the
in the
maps.
community.
The other one, no, that was in some of my, the other one is,
Right.
was the draft of the overlay district, and that is, cause it was never passed, it didn't go past the draft thing, but does that,
Yeah.
I have, yeah,
So
have
if-
an
I think
expert
if you-
look at that and say, oh, yes, I understand this is.
Right, so an aquifer overlay district is Steve's best estimation of the recharge area. Okay, this may not match up one-to-one with his aquifer map, because even this aquifer here, which is located, if you're driving east again on 104A, and you're going downhill, and there's this like terrace, and you go down, and just as you get to the bottom of the hill, and you can begin to see the wetland on the left, and you can look up that valley, you can see that from the trailer park up to above the terrace, it's a big U-shaped valley, okay? This is only right in the center of it, okay? And up on the sides, it's silt and clay, okay? But the water from the hill, up on the sides, runs across that silt and clay, and where there are streams, it can recharge it. If there's areas where the sand and gravel is exposed on the ground surface, the water from the hill can also get in there. So the recharge area it's not just the area over the aquifer, but it's the area within the water catchment that could recharge the aquifer. So I
That's
would,
what I'm interested in, is the biggest scenario, the biggest,
right,
yeah, that's what,
yeah,
not
And-
just the aquifer, but, yeah,
yeah. So Stearns and Wheeler in 1990,
yeah.
right? Jerry Gould, who wrote that, he used the surface water flow divide as the recharge area. I imagine Steve did as well, because that's what you would do, because the water is gonna, much of the water might get into the county ditch and go out to the lake and never have a chance to go to recharge. But there are areas where it will recharge, and so you do include the catchment as part of the recharge area. And I imagine this is the overlay that Steve came up with, and it's the aquifer plus an enlarged area.
Now, an overlay area,
Mm-hmm.
is that the largest, let's see. If there were an oil spill
Mm-hmm.
right outside this estimated, I'm guessing, overlay area, 5 miles, 2 miles, 50 feet. That's what I can't wrap my head around. Where would anything, if something were to happen, how it would affect our recharge area?
Sure.
That's what I'm trying, like, I want somebody with their red pen to go, oh no, go all out in the air.
Right. And
Does that make sense, that question?
sure, so what's important to wellhead overlays and groundwater protection areas, is, travel time. The amount of time it takes for contaminant to hit the ground before it hits the water well and knocks you offline. So, assuming this is your aquifer, and we come up here, and, we have, you know, the trailer park there, and this water table, we're just gonna end it here because this is probably bedrock or, it's bedrock or till, probably. Okay, so, but this, we know that this is all silt and clay. So if you have a gas station right here, and it leaks, it has to go down all the way through all this silt and clay before it hits the water table. And the water table, let's say, is in sand and gravel, that it's sand, this is all sand and gravel that butts up against whatever that hard texture is. Once it gets into here, it will move at the velocity that the groundwater is moving in the sand and gravel, which will be different than the amount of time it takes it to get down through the soil to there. So when you create your overlays, it's all based on time of travel. So if you have an estimate of how thick that clay is, you might say it would take 10 years for that to get into your aquifer, right? But if you're a drop of water and you land here, you're running this way. If you're a drop of water and you land here, you're running this way, right? So the area of recharge will be this divide right here. Because water that originates at the top of the hill here could run down the slope all the way to here where it can get into the sand and gravel at the surface. So the overlay district will capture all the water that would run to the aquifer. Now, there may be reasons in particular cases where you would say, yes, it comes down here, but there's a canal right here and it can't get past the canal. You know, there may be specifics, but as a first approximation, you use that drainage divide.
So it's highest to lowest, like a bowl.
Exactly.
You know, just all the highest areas around
Right,
into the lowest.
that's right. And so, you could have, a bowl, which is, that's an appropriate way to think of the Fairhaven Aquifer when you're heading east and you look to the right. If those trees weren't there, you would pretty much see a bowl going up to just north of Simmons, okay? And, all the water that falls within that bowl is gonna get focused down into the aquifer, if it doesn't run off or it doesn't precipitate or evaporate or something. And that's what the overlay district is designed to do, is to manage activity on the land surface over the catchment zone, over the recharge zone.
Can't the water flowing on the other side of your diagram there still end up in our aquifer if this vein of gravel and sand follows the contour of the earth?
Yeah, well,
So they could get water from Syracuse or Tully
Right.
or,
well, no, not, definitely
well,
not.
that would go the other way, but Syracuse.
No, you'd have to pump enough water, the water equivalent of like a Niagara Falls to draw water from that far away. But you could draw water from other sand and gravel aquifers. So what Winkley's map shows is that over here, let's say, you could have another sand and gravel aquifer, where if you could put in a well right here, you know, you could create a drawdown, and you have another aquifer. Now, the water right here isn't gonna run in there, but if we take this hump in a third dimension here, right, and if it was low enough, sure, water could run around. I don't think they're that hydraulically connected myself. I don't know what their shapes are, but at the rates that you're pumping and the distance between the different aquifers, I think you can imagine that there's a hydraulic divide between them, unless
make sure we understand this right. If we have, something over the top of our aquifer, and it's an oil spill, you said it would take 10 years for that oil to go through all the layers of sand and dirt and clay
It depends where the spill occurs,
and what's underneath it.
what's underneath it.
Yeah.
And the viscosity of whatever the substance was that was.
Or its solubility.
Okay.
So salt, which is incredibly soluble, is typically used to map flow paths in groundwater. You just take a well and you get a whole bunch of Morton salt and pour it in there, and it's dissolved in the water, and then you measure the salinity of wells that are down gradient, and you can tell how it got there. We don't do that anymore, we use much more subtle chemicals. But yeah, to your point, pumping at the rates that you're pumping, I can't imagine that you're bringing in other aquifers mile or two away. You're just not creating a large enough drawdown cone.
That were presently
Presently,
pumping,
yes.
year round, average,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
even when the slow period in the winter and an average.
So, there are a few things about this aquifer that I've seen, that lead me to believe that this aquifer is susceptible to drought. One is the water chemistry. Now, I've seen lots of water chemistry to meet the Department of Health requirements, but I've only seen one full chemical analysis where they included things like dissolved solids. Dissolved solids are, everybody knows about salt. You put it in water, it's a sodium and it's a chloride molecule. When it gets in the water, if those sodium and the chloride break apart, and now they're dissolved solids. The dissolved solids in this water the total is really low. It's about 174. That is 100 or 200 less than the drinking water from Skaneateles Lake. That tells me that water hasn't flowed very far. So rainwater, when it falls, has very little dissolved solids in it. Very, very little. It's not distilled water, but it'll have some. Once the water hits the ground, it starts dissolving solids, salts, and so forth, and it carries them down to the aquifer. The longer the flow path to the extraction point, the higher the concentration of dissolved solids. So the longer the water's been in contact with the soil, the higher the concentration of dissolved solids. This water has very low dissolved solids. It's what we would call it's dilute. It means it hasn't traveled very far. And it would be on par with what I think the catchment area is. Well, it's not there anymore. But what I would think the catchment area is when you look up that valley and you see that bridge. And I think it extends a little bit further to the south of Simmons Road. There are geological processes that I think move it, even though the drainage divide is right at Simmons Road, probably the recharge zone for this aquifer is a little south of that. And that's about a mile or two, and that would be consistent with not a whole lot of dissolved solids.
We're sitting in a situation where we've been having no trouble. Now we have a possible individual corporation who wants to come here and drill wells and take water out. So the real situation is, how do we address whether that's good or bad? And that seems to me that's come to the chase. It was
Science.
yeah, okay, we gotta find that out, and then, because then we gotta have, so we're gonna stop it, we have to have data that's gonna say, we're right to stop it.
Right. So, I don't know, I know where there's a planned development, but I don't know any of the specifics about it. But you
I
need
don't
to
think we do either.
right. But you need to make a decision, is that near or over the recharge zone? And is the activity going to use chemicals or other processes that could threaten the recharge, or could it put down enough blacktop or impermeable surface that it prevents recharge? And these are all decisions you can make after you do your 72-hour pumping test and you know what the aquifer can do and where the limits
just summed it up with what you just said about the fact that the water is so pure because it has such a slow runoff and it doesn't gain minerals because it's basically just rainwater and snow.
And it's
So
going right into
it's
the
not
aquifer.
just in, underground minutia of water that's just sitting there. It's based on the environment. And it's not,
Right, so it's
it's not an endless supply.
It's so dilute that if this is the cemetery or that ridge or the terrace over here, I think you're getting recharge from the sides. That partially accounts for the really dilute water. And some is coming from the south.
And if you remove forestation in any area, you're gonna reduce even more, correct?
Right, so when you take away trees, then you have more runoff.
So you said earlier about digging test wells to sort of map that, is that where the next step is?
Yeah.
Elaborate on that.
Right. So, Steve and Brian, Bird, and Andrew have done a really good job of mapping the quaternion geology, the glacial geology here. Now they did it by getting out of the car and digging a hole in the ground, and talking to people and talking to well drillers. But there's no data from your aquifer. There's from where you go down the hill and the terrace is on your right to the trailer park, except for your wells right there. There's no wells for a mile to the south, and there are no wells for about half a mile to the north. And that's the lens of the aquifer. So the electrical resistivity data suggests that your wells are not in the center of that aquifer. And it may be thicker in the center. So one of the things you need to do is to find the center of the aquifer, and then you need to find the edges. And the way you do that is you go out with the drilling rig, and they drill a hole down. I have them go all the way to bedrock, and put in a monitoring well. And then you can, when you do the pumping test, in that well, you can watch the water level go up or down. And that will tell the hydrogeologist where the water is coming from, and a whole lot of other information. What
And
the maximum safety
We've
is.
asked Ed to give us a map of where he would suggest the test wells,
I can do that.
right?
And it might tell us how much water can safely be drawn out.
It should,
The key issue.
if it's designed properly, it should be able to tell you that. And what it will give you is this, it'll give us all these drawdown curves, and then using mathematics, you predict to an infinite time, and then that's the maximum safe yield, that you can take that year in, year out.
If we were gonna have to know that to satisfactorily resist this if we don't think it should be allowed.
Right.
Because the other guy's gonna try to get data to say, I can safely take it out, I bet you.
Well, his land may not be in the same aquifer, correct?
It is mapped currently as the same aquifer, the land to the north, it is. That sand and gravel that's on the west flank of the cemetery, if you pull your car off and you look at that, that's an old gravel pit. That's probably what the matrix of your aquifer looks like, something like that, but I think a little coarser. But yeah, we don't know, the truth is we don't know. But I would imagine, based on my conceptual site model, that this is a gusher coming out from under the ice, that this sand and gravel is present in the subsurface back to the lake. But there's no reason it has to go straight once it crosses 104.8. I mean, you look at Steve's maps, they're all braided, right? So we don't know where it goes. It may actually veer up to the right, we just don't know.
Right, and funding, just to put it on the table here for the group, because I know you're the people most interested. These additional tests are not funded yet. All that's the additional, all that's funded right now is the 72-hour pump test to get a safe yield so they can figure out whether to put in the third a Sterling well in our well field. But this additional drilling of all these other test wells, nobody's paying for it yet. So we not only need to get a good plan for it, where we say exactly where we want these wells, we need the town or the village to step up and fund that to be done, and done right soon.
In an earlier meeting, we talked about the fact that if somebody's gonna apply for a permit, that we had the ability to make the permit applier pay for various legal stuff. Would it cover something like this, these kind of test wells? Or is that gonna be an argument?
Well, our land use regulations does allow, for us to, at the expense of an applicant, to, acquire, people that we can draw information from, so experts in the field that we need help with.
So hopefully, if we actually apply for a permit, we can say, okay, you're gonna have to pay for all these test drills.
Yeah,
Does that
but-
sound right?
Yes, we could, but Sterling Water Stewards has preferred the approach of implementing an overlay protection zone before we would have a permit application during this nice moratorium period, because we feel that the overlay protection zone gives us a stronger legal footing. So in order to do a really good job of the overlay protection zone, that's why we would like this additional test well mapping to be done at the time of the 72-hour pump tests, which are coming up. Because until we really define our aquifer, we're not going to have the strongest scientific. And that's a
And we have
much
to pay
better
for it.
route to go than waiting for the special use permit thing, to
And we
just
have to
get
pay
her
for
done.
that. The taxpayers have to pay for that. Town would have to pay for that.
Somebody's gotta pay for that, but I think it's not insurmountable amount of money, and it could be done and should be done, it's long overdue to be done.
Just as a rough guesstimate, what would a well that you're talking about like this cost?
It's very hard to estimate for two reasons. One, there's the water that's in the aquifer that's not drawn there anymore, is in some places in a confined or semi-confined condition. That means that there's clay on top of it, and the aquifer is being fed by sand and gravel that's up on the slope. So the pressure below the clay is equal to the head, the top of that water up there. We've all thought of, we used to hang suspended ceilings by getting a long hose, clear hose, and you would run around the room and you could mark the same level on both sides. Well, if you put our thumb on it and don't let any water come out, and then we drop this one down, when I take my thumb off, the water's just gonna shoot up out of here because of the weight of the water up here. Well, in a confined aquifer, where you have an aquifer that's covered with clay, but that sand and gravel is hydraulically connected to recharge up on the hill. When you drill through the clay, it wants to come back, that water wants to come out, and it pushes sand and gravel up into the drill pipe stem, and from that point forward, you have to case the well, and it becomes not fairly expensive, it becomes more expensive. So a well to 50 feet, let's say is bedrock, and you're going through 10 or 15 feet of confined gravel, may cost $5,000 to $7,000. Now, if you get up on the slope and you only have to go down 20 feet and it's not confined, they could do 3 or 4 of them in a day, right? So the conditions you encounter determine the cost. And not all drill rigs, so when you get out into the valley, into the low area where we think it's confined, you would bring a different rig to be prepared to have to case the well. Whereas if you're doing shallow wells around the perimeter, you would use a cheaper well. So it's hard to tell, but it's in the
Can you
tens of thousands of dollars.
And how many of these wells do you estimate that?
Well, the state requires 4, I believe. I would add a couple to that list. I read Steve's recommendation, he did not put dots on the page, but he did talk about distance from the pumping well, which is directly from the state requirement. I always would add one more well in every pumping test I've ever done, and very few regulations call for it. But I would always, and if I'm not around at the time, you need a well right next to the pumping well. And I'm talking 20 feet away. Okay? Because you don't know how efficient your well screen is. So you could be pumping really hard and getting 200 gallons per minute, 300 gallons per minute. And then when you turn that off, we do what's known as a recovery test, which is how fast does the water come back up? And what you're actually measuring is how fast does this cone depression flatten out, okay? Well, if your well isn't very efficient and the water can't come in quickly, it'll lag way behind. And so what will happen is if it's an inefficient well, you turn it off, right? And let's say you were drawing down to here. At time 0, you turn it off, right? If this is an inefficient well, this one will come right up. And this one will just come up really slowly because it's just passing the water into it very slowly. It doesn't have high efficiency. And that comes from the fact that you've been pumping the bejesus out of this. You've been sucking sand and gravel towards it, and just like the strainer in your stationary tub gets all that hair and pistachio shells, and it doesn't go as fast, right? It becomes inefficient. You need to estimate your well efficiency. And I preach this, and sometimes people do it, and when you do it, you get much better data. You have a much more accurate representation, but it does cost a little extra money. Some people would say, well, it doesn't matter because that's the well that we're working for, that's the efficiency, whatever that says. But it's not, that's true, if you're just worried about how much water you're gonna pull out. But if you want an accurate representation of the aquifer, you need the other well.
Are there grant opportunities out there for funding for this kind of test?
There are, but our problem is that they are best done at the time of the 72-hour pump test.
Yep.
Right?
Observation wells?
These, yes.
Yeah, well, they're required by the DEC.
Right, and so they want to do these 72-hour pump tests within the next couple months. And, you know, it is time to get this done because and so say we need 7 wells, say they cost $10,000 apiece. Say we have some areas where you've got deep clay and it's gonna cost more. For $70,000 or $100,000 between the village and the town, we don't have the time to wait around to get a grant. I'm completely focused on the moratorium period. I'm completely concerned about when the moratorium is lifted, that we do not have adequate, really legal protections. And so if we were to take this opportunity when we're already having a 72-hour pump test that's already planned and being paid for, and do this additional, then we would be able to have the data. And we'd have it now, and it would enable us as a community to fix the problem that we just don't know enough about our aquifer. And with that data, we could make some very firm policy decisions that would be backed up by science.
Could you just clarify when you're saying the test wells, are we thinking just specific to the property owned by the Village of Fairhaven, Town of Sterling? Or are you thinking of the broader, including the privately owned?
Yes, the location of those wells should be dictated by the estimated extent of the aquifer, regardless of property ownership.
What are the legalities, I'm sure you've looked into that, for requiring or requesting test wells on private property? Anyone done any homework on that?
I've asked questions, but the only answers I got were like, well, you could put them on the edge of the property in the public domain if you couldn't get permission from the landowner, was a suggestion I heard. But what do you know about that, Ed?
Well, you have to get a legal agreement with the property owner, and that includes promises that you'll clean everything up and so forth. And in most cases, we don't run into much trouble with that, but I don't
Takes
know.
time.
It does take time.
I wanted to kind of respond a little bit to that. Someone asked about legalities. I'm a zoning lawyer. My name is Doug Zamlis, and I represent the Sterling Water Stewards. you're dealing with two issues here. As you heard Ed describe a concept of maximum safe yield, how much water you can pull out of your aquifer safely without, as Ed said, damaging it. You have a proposal regarding a water bottling plant, and that's the issue. That's the issue with the water bottling plant, is how much can you take out of your aquifer safely. I want to point out that you do not need all of these data for the town board to amend your zoning law to say that water bottling plants will not be an allowed use in the town of Sterling. There's no constitutional right to a water bottling facility like there is a topless dancing bar. So the town has the authority to regulate the uses of land within its boundaries, and your concern about your aquifer is sufficient basis for the town board to amend its zoning law. The second issue you have is the protection of your aquifer from stuff going in it, and we've talked about pollutants, and that's the area I think you need the data for, to understand where your recharge areas are, what areas you need to protect, what land uses you might allow in those recharge areas. That is a very data-intensive effort, but a concern to protect your aquifer is sufficient enough for your town board to actually legislate and say, we're not going to allow those types of facilities in our town. Another question was also asked, who pays for that? Let's say an applicant comes before you and asks you for a special use permit for a water bottling facility. Before you can even make a determination on whether or not to grant that permit, you have to satisfy the State Environmental Quality Review Act. And any action which may have the potential for one significant environmental impact is supposed to get a positive declaration and require a draft environmental impact statement. And that's the applicant's job and responsibility. So in terms of assembling all those data and information that an applicant might need to convince you to grant you a permit, that's on their dime. Not only that, if you require an environmental impact statement, you are entitled to seek reimbursement from the applicant for your costs in reviewing the environmental impact statement. So I just, as I've sat here today, it occurs to me you've got two issues. You got water going out and you have water going in. And I think the town can kind of think of them as separate issues. Protecting the water going out is something the town board has the authority right now to do. Where you might want to enact an overlay district, which is just another zoning district which doesn't follow the traditional zoning district boundaries, that's the type of issue that I think you need these well and these hydrogeologic data for. But I wanted to point out that if the town wanted to say, we don't want those types of facilities in our town because we have a concern that it might adversely affect our aquifer, that's sufficient for the town board to act.
Thank you.
Could I just clarify, hi, I'm
Hey,
Joe.
Joe.
I'm also an attorney, although I'm not a zoning attorney, but I just want to clarify something in case it's not clear to everybody. So when Doug says the town can legislate that we're not gonna have a bottling plant, that is different than the special permit process. The special permit process, if we have it in the zoning law that bottling plants are allowed, but they're subject to the special permit process, that makes it fairly easy to get a special permit for a bottling plant. And that's way different than the town simply saying, no bottling plants. So the legislative and the administrative issues are different, and you need to understand that very important distinction.
Thank you, Julie. And New York courts have held that if a use is allowed by special use permit, that's a legislative finding that use is in harmony with the orderly development of that neighborhood. A special use permit does allow you to impose conditions, but 90% of special use permit applications are granted. Your zoning law provides a pathway to approval.
Could I run a couple of these, notes that I made, make sure they're correct? You did think that, our aquifer is susceptible to drought.
I do.
Okay, and if asked, you could write it out as to why.
Well, I only have a couple pieces of data,
Okay.
that's why I use susceptible. But there is anecdotal data that in the past, water usage has been restricted because the wells weren't producing. In 1984, the wells did not produce enough water to meet the fire code, and a storage tank had to be added, even though they were estimating yield from those wells at numbers that I think are much higher than they really are. And the third point is that the catchment basin area is fairly small, and that's confirmed by the dilute water. So the water is not staying in the aquifer for a long time, which means that if we have a drought year or 2 years, you're dependent on recharge running through the system. And a drought year or 2 drought years could bring the water table way down, and you might not be able to produce as much water.
Okay, and the second one was, you were talking about the low level of dissolved solids,
Yes.
and that indicates that the water recharge area is a short distance.
Right.
Okay.
So, in aquifers in the Appalachian Mountains, let's say, where in North Carolina you have mountains in the western part of the state, but that bedrock goes underneath the coastal plain, right? And people will drill wells in Charlotte, in the Triangle area, where Duke is, right? And actually hit a productive bedrock layer where that water is coming from in the Appalachian Mountains. And that water will be briny. It had been in the rock for so long, thousands of years probably, that water will be actually charcoal colored and briny and have carbon dioxide and methane in it. And that's all because it was in that rock formation. What we have here is water is almost rainwater. It means it didn't travel very far at all. And that means that the catchment area is small, and that if you don't get rain, there's a good chance that the puddle will dry. Smaller puddles disappear faster than big puddles, and the water won't be there for you to have.
You see, I think those 2 points go to the reason why we should be concerned about our little aquifer.
Correct.
I mean, a couple of those, you know?
And then, well, the corollary too is that since you're dependent on recharge, if anything is spilled on the recharge area, it'll get to you quickly, because it's a pass-through. The retention time in that aquifer is short. That's why you have low dissolved solids. That means that if something gets in there, it'll get to your well faster.
That brings up a question I have in terms of where they're proposing the bulk extraction, the gravel bed, they've done it. You see the gravel, you know it's there. Did you say that there's a layer of clay between that gravel and where the aquifer is?
Out in the valley, it's been mapped, yes, by the geologist. I know
So-
you go up the hill a little bit and you look to your left and there it is.
Yeah.
But I think that lens goes from there under the clay into your aquifer.
When I see the gravel there, I think in terms of whatever should be on that property. If you can see the gravel, if there is some kind of a spill, and the gravel being, so permeable that whatever spills is gonna go through in a heartbeat.
Oh, it'll go right through.
It's gonna go right to the aquifer.
Yeah, it will. Yeah, and different contaminants travel at different velocities, but yes, it will get through.
It's not gonna take much time.
Yeah, I think if Steve or Brian or Andrew were here I don't know what they were thinking about the way they draw the aquifer confined north of 104A. But I think what they would say is that that sand and gravel unit is going down underneath, so that is a direct injection port to the aquifer. And I think that sand and gravel may also crop out up the slope to the east a little bit towards the trailer park as well. Yes?
If you were thinking our aquifer is susceptible to drought, do you have an increased concern with how we've had lighter winters and perhaps less precipitation during the summer?
Absolutely. That has been the trend. Climate change look at this summer. I have a project going where I have a weather station, and we got 6.5 inches of rain near Manlius, New York, in 3 days. And we get 36 inches a year. And just look at the last 3 days. We got 2.5 inches at my house. So climate change has created a hotter, humid summer for us. We get more thunderstorms, more, in the language of climate change, catastrophic events. And our winters, we haven't been getting as much snow.
Yeah, we don't even need to plow a 300-foot road. I can drive in there all year round.
I snow blow, and I've been really happy with the last few years.
Second question, what's the procedure to ask the zoning board to do exactly what that lawyer just said we should do? Who needs to ask you to make that law happen?
Well, we're gonna,
We have a zoning commission that works to, when we need to make changes or some issues come up that we haven't, been accustomed to, don't have, is a part of our land use regulation. That's when we work together as a group. Then it has to come before the planning board. The planning board then sends it to the town board for a public hearing and their vote.
And has someone asked you to do that work in regards to banning water plants?
it hasn't been asked, but it's been buzzing around.
It's been a part of our conversation.
Yes.
So who's supposed to
Part of why we're
ask?
here tonight and listening to this,
Sure.
is like,
Yeah.
we need this information.
Well, it seems like it's pretty simple. If that lawyer said, you have the right to do a new law and ban it, we should probably focus on that also. And who needs to ask? Is it the community that needs to ask, or what's the right
Actually,
procedure?
nobody has to ask. One of your town board members can prepare a draft local law and introduce it to the town board. It's the town board that has the legislative authority to change your zoning law, and the only requirement is that it be consistent with your comprehensive plan, which is probably fairly broadly worded. So oftentimes, a planning board will make a recommendation to a town board that they consider legislation. Citizens can request the town board, but this board doesn't actually have the authority to do that. It's your elected town board that has that authority to adopt legislation. So a piece of legislation can get to them by any number of ways. And typically, if a planning board makes a recommendation to a town board, because you folks on a monthly basis are dealing with the zoning law and these issues, typically that carries a lot of weight with your elected officials, who often defer to the planning experts like yourselves.
Did you wanna?
Right, well, I was just going to say, the zoning commission is an advisory board, answers to the town board, and usually it would be the town board, or occasionally the planning board will make suggestions to the zoning commission to look at, ambiguities in the land use regulations, or address additional new activities, etc. The town board, my observation has been, up until the last few months, not really receptive to wanting to make, more restrictive activities in the area.
Is there an election coming up?
Yes.
What about other than a bottling plant? Should that be included in the law?
Well, bulk extraction, I think.
Yeah, bulk or selling to another,
Well, I think, I'm not a lawyer. I did sleep at the Holiday Inn last night. I think correct me if I'm wrong, any lawyers here, the law will be directed to extraction of groundwater. There are other extraction purposes for cooling at power generating plants or for food operations. You know, it isn't just water bottling. I think you would wanna protect from extraction.
And you may wanna have a threshold, a certain gallons per day or whatever to allow, you know, heating and cooling, but not allow those types of, uses which may exceed the safe, maximum yield of your aquifer.
Right now, the bulk extraction is under commercial uses.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we can't restrict the agricultural, industry, but if we, in special permit, why can't we ask the town board to make it not permitted for bulk extraction for commercial use?
There's no
Well-
reason, as the attorney said, there's no reason we couldn't.
So I mean, do we need to go through the committee, the zoning commission? Can we just do it? Ask the town board to make it non-permitted for commercial water use, commercial bulk extraction.
I applaud this idea. I just say, we've been thinking about this for a while, and you would want to safeguard the existing people who are doing commercial extraction, you know, who truck water to people's wells who have run dry, and maybe put a quantitative limit, you know, so to keep it at the kind of use we've got now, which hasn't hurt anything, and, you know, and so to have it well thought out, if you go in that direction, so you're not going to step on people who are already doing some commercial
And
that serves the community.
They would be a prior lawful non-conforming use and would be
Exactly, they
entitled
would be
to
existing.
continue.
Yes,
Basically
that, so we've been wording it new commercial bulk extraction.
I don't think there's anybody in the town of Sterling now doing bulk extraction for commercial.
Just agriculture.
Pardon me?
Just agriculture.
Well, that's what I would consider a commercial use though. They're
There's the
selling
one
it.
on Cosgrove Road, that, you know, Merton Handy's, it's no longer being used.
Well, those uses like that, you know, you would want to keep them available for
Oh, yeah.
people. Yeah, yeah. And so when I say commercial, I mean they're doing it as a business. They're extracting the water and,
But we can't set a limit on number of gallons until we have a kind of study that says, and you'd have to do it for every aquifer. I mean, the Cosgrove Road aquifer, if somebody decided to do bulk extraction there, are you gonna do a test there? Right now, we're concerned about,
well,
the Fairhaven aquifer.
we've
but
been-
there are other aquifers.
no,
that-
I think Sterling Water Stewards has consistently said we need to protect all the aquifers in the town of Sterling. Because the reason that they're here on a municipal aquifer is because it's beautiful water. And so it threatens every aquifer in the township. So all of the rural landowners need to be protected from somebody buying land next to them and doing this exact same thing. And so it would be very good to have a town-wide limit on the amount of water that you can extract. I mean, the history here is that water's becoming a very valuable resource, so they're moving in and they're looking for it. And the whole township has a vulnerability. And so if we need protection all the way around from things that are beyond what serves our community and what is traditional here.
So, no, I would add to that, first of all, I think all the other aquifers are probably comparable in size to what we see here. When I look at the geology's official maps, other than the fact that they're all going in different directions, they're all approximately the same width. And we know that the erosion and depth to till or bedrock is probably comparable because it's the same processes that occurred throughout the county. So I don't think you would, I think it's reasonable that more likely than not, all the aquifers that are mapped by Winkley are comparable in size. And they're probably comparable in recharge mechanisms, and they're probably dilute. So, and then the other thing I would mention is that some of them may actually be a whole lot more vulnerable, because as you go to the south, that's why you see more farmland out there. As you get into a richer soil, and that means it's clayer, you have more clay, and that actually a greater percentage of those aquifers may be covered with clay and silt, and have smaller recharge areas. So you may have a wide gravel aquifer underneath it, but it's only being recharged from a small area. So you have a small hose going into it, and they're more vulnerable to depletion because they don't have as large a recharge area. I think you're in a kind of unique situation here because you have this slope back towards the lake. So a lot of the sand and gravel has been exposed by waves along Lake Iroquois, and just by the wind that comes out of Canada all the time, and the rain that is percolating and creating chimney bluffs and just washing all that soil out towards the lake. So I think you have probably the aquifers along Lake Iroquois probably have a higher recharge than I would think the aquifers further to the south, just as a first approximation. I would think they're more vulnerable than the ones to the north.
It was brought up at I believe at a meeting, but I had someone explain to me that going back to your original diagram with Lake Ontario and the wells down here, we wouldn't have to worry about a Dollar General because the water flows from south to north. So anything that would go on heading north beyond the wells wouldn't be problematic. Is there?
Not necessarily true.
Right.
So as a first principle, down gradient activity won't affect up gradient, except in a confined groundwater condition. So because the down gradient doesn't have any recharge, right, because it has the clay on top of it, right, it's getting its water from the slopes and from up gradient. You can, depending on your extraction rate and the amount of recharge, you can reverse that flow, what's called a pressure head, and you can reverse that flow back to the north, back to the south. So when I drew this picture here,
Right.
I drew cross section through a big circle, right? And that cone of depression actually extends all the way out. And depending on how much water you can pump and how fast the aquifer can deliver the water, that cone will go further and further. If you pump it harder, or it's a finer matrix and the water doesn't get there as fast. And if it was strictly unconfined, I would imagine that your infinite drawdown curve would extend north of 104A. I would imagine that. If at 104A now that is all covered with clay and it has slow recharge, what will happen is you'll have that, if this is all unconfined up here, you'll have a nice circular cone of depression, but then when you get to here, it'll go out that pipe, right? And it'll be pulling that water in. It'll be a flow boundary. So I don't know what those conditions are. At first approximation, you might be able to say it's down gradient, you don't have to worry about it, but there are situations in a confined or semi-confined where you could actually, instead of having a nice circular cone, it would go out into those areas where it's confined or semi-confined. We just don't know. Yeah.
So there's, and I don't even know if I'm using the right words, but the Dollar General that's talked about on that same piece of property, what I heard from you is the biggest issue would be an asphalt parking lot. If a Dollar General was placed there and left a stone parking lot, would it be okay in your mind?
Well, it depends. So a stone or gravel parking lot is the same as the stone and gravel that's propping out in your recharge areas. So oil that drips off of the bottom of engines, the 5-gallon cans that, somebody pulls in and then, because they're running out of gas, and then the gas that they spill, I think those contaminants would have a faster migration pathway to the aquifer
I see.
through the gravel. And asphalt, which is also permeable, it's hard to imagine, but asphalt is permeable depending on whether or not you seal it and how you seal it. Concrete is also permeable, but yeah, I think that there's no way of ensuring that anything that lands on the ground won't go into the subsurface.
So you're worried about more car traffic in an area that might have contamination brought into it?
Yes, I'm just concerned I'm concerned about your recharge area, and then I'm concerned about the introduction of contaminants.
Okay.
And, a roof, there's a big parking lot area around it, half acre, 2 acres, that's, you have a small recharge area already, so
Taking space away.
it is, yes.
And didn't you just say earlier that if a lot of pressure is packing it down, that also hurts the health of the aquifer?
That is true.
So cars driving on it, concrete and building and people and stuff being put on top is putting additional weight onto it, which compacts it.
Yes, and I'll tell you a quick anecdote. I was doing a study down in Sherburne, New York, back in the 90s, a long time ago. And I had data loggers in these 3 wells on the west side, and I had data loggers on the east side. And I just wanted to see the flow patterns. I wasn't doing any pumping. And about 3 times a day, the wells on the west side would come up by a foot, and the wells on the east side would come up by a couple inches. And there was a railroad track line down the back, but I thought it wasn't used anymore. Where I was working, the old Gerald electronics plant, had been out of business for years. But trains would go by, and they would compress the aquifer and push the water up a foot. And then 100 feet away, it came up a couple of inches, actually 200 feet away. And so, yes, it actually, there are implications to these things.
So, I think it's my final question, but is there a lawyer aspect to preventing the commercialization of the aquifer area other than this bulk extraction?
Well, that's all controlled through your zoning law, through your ability to control the uses of land that are allowed within your town. Bulk extraction, commercial, retail, the town determines what uses it wants.
Yeah, but this Darrell General will end up in the special permit bucket and get approved, probably.
That's why we want a zone that's a source water protection zone where any uses that could do groundwater contamination are absolutely prohibited. And new commercial bulk water extraction is prohibited in this special zone. And that would replace, for that area around our public aquifer, if you wanted to do that project now, you would have to address a zoning law instead of a special permit. That's what Sterling Water's whole drum we've been beating is, that we want the zoning change. And Doug is mentioning that we also could call for the legislative change that would absolutely ban in this township any bottling plants. So both things would be real cool to have soon.
One way to think of this, and I know this is, throwing, driving a tack with a sledgehammer, but if you go to any municipal water supply reservoir, they have a fence around it, right? And you can't go over the fence and throw something into the reservoir. Well, you have a reservoir. That is your reservoir, and it's filled instead of the town or city where it's pumped up to high places and it acts as a tank. you let nature run the water into your reservoir. Now, you do have dirt on top of it, but in places the dirt is so thin that the water is right there. In other places it's thicker. So you have different degrees of protection on it. But what you're really talking about protecting is your water reservoir. You know, it is, when I tried to make the analogy of a bucket with a sponge in it, I mean, you just have a bucket there. And it fills up and then you pump it out. And you need to keep a lid on it, right? Like if you're collecting the old cisterns that you collect roof water, right? You put them in the basement, but if they're outside in a barrel, you put a lid on them. So that's what wellhead protection, water source protection, it's about putting that lid on it to protect what's in there.
Can I ask a couple
Sure.
of questions, maybe one or two of them are said? Are there any swamps in a recharge area? Cause they're a good source, aren't they?
So there are wetlands. On the south side of, so in the old stream bed, I don't know how much it flows now, but I've seen phragmites growing, so on town property by the wells, there's some wetlands, and then on the north side, there are some wetlands. And that's where the water table is. Now, it could just be a perched water table on top of clay, you know, or it could be the deeper gravel. I don't have any idea. I don't think anybody does. But generally, they're not a good source of water. They're better for frogs and red-winged blackbirds. But because they're usually in hydric soil, which is clayey, and it doesn't transmit water through it quickly.
The drumlins that you mentioned earlier, I was under the impression that they were formed by the ice pushing. You're saying it was done by the water that was melting from the ice.
Right. So, 30 years ago, if somebody like me was standing here, they would have told you it was formed by the ice. We now know that it was formed by the water under the ice.
And that shows the power of water.
Absolutely, and it was the water carved up into the ice and created a cavern. And then as that cavern got larger, like any pipe, you put water in a smaller pipe, it goes faster. You put in a larger pipe, it goes slower. So as that cavern got larger, the water got slower, and all the sand and gravel fell out. Okay. And then it filled up, and it's much more complex than that. And some drumlins are actually made by different processes, but I think the ones that you have here, these were made in what I like to say, the soul of the glacier, right on its lip.
The last question, you mentioned about the circle of the water going down there. In the southern hemisphere, does it really go to different directions?
Yes.
It does?
You can find YouTubes where somebody draws a line, says this is the equator, and they start 20 feet this way, and they walk across it, it slows down, and it starts going that
So
way.
it's not an old wives' tale. Thank you.
Isn't that funny?
I thought it was going to
And I just have one thing for the record that I would like you to address while we have you here. You said that the town really ought to be worried about the gravel beds. You said that there were 3 major gravel beds, that if there were anything spilled there.
Yes.
Could you address that?
Yes. So, this ice tunnel and discharge ran out of energy about 100, 150 feet upslope, probably about the level of the water in the ice itself. And so from about the south side of your property, or the hayfield or cornfield, whatever it is this year, into the trees, sand is actually, and gravel is actually present on the ground surface. By the time you get up to Simmons Road, it's flat. And Andrew maps an ice position, a terminal ice position, just to the north of that. And it is possible that that was the position that fed this gusher? I suspect not. But out in front of it, when that water came out of being confined in the ice, it lost all of its energy and it just splayed out a big gravel deposit. And that's the gravel deposit from about 150 yards, well, the gravel that you see at the ground surface, but it's also present on the slope a little bit. From there, all the way down south of Simmons Road. I think anywhere up there, you go out with a backhoe and you dig down and you're in sand and gravel. And I think that is flowing to the north towards your well, towards your wells. So you're particularly vulnerable up there to, like, truck tripping maybe isn't gonna be a big deal, but somebody parks a 5,000-gallon fuel oil tank there in the gravel part because it was blizzarding and couldn't get home that night, and then something gives way, and if you lost 5,000 gallons and up there, you'd be worried. Yeah. Now, again, this is based on very sketchy information and a conceptual site model, but I've been a glacial geologist since 1980. So I'm pretty confident that that is your sand gravel up there.
When you have a spring come out the side of the hill,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why it always comes out the side, but is that from an aquifer or is that just from rock? Or?
So most springs that come out on the side of a hill, if it's like dirt above and dirt below, if you went right to where it's coming out and you took a trowel and you just scraped it off clean, you'll see that there's a clay layer there, and that's perched water table that I answered somebody's question, and then the slope was cut, and so it is groundwater theoretically, but it's just perched up on a clay layer. A lot of the times you drive the thruway, especially in the spring or late winter, and you see those big icicles coming out. If you carefully look, you'll see a lot of them are coming out where the soil meets the bedrock, but they're also coming out where the shale is sandy, and so the water's flowing through the sand very slowly. And they always occur only on the north side because the ones that face south melt. But you go east towards Albany around Utica, and they're just wonderful. And so to be called a spring, water has to flow out of an orifice, a hole, and it has to flow at a quantity that you could use. Now, I get it a lot. Some hydrogeologists don't accept that. They say, so I would say if it's just coming out, trickling and making an icicle, that's a seep. Water's just seeping out. It's not really a spring. To be a spring, it needs to flow fast enough that you can get a cup underneath it and use it. That would be my definition. There are lots of hydrogeologists who would challenge me on that.
Anybody else? Well, I think this was very informative, and I learned a lot for sure, and I'll appreciate everybody's questions, and I think this was very, very beneficial to all of us, and I really
Thank you for
appreciate your
inviting me.
time, and gave us a lot to think about for sure.
Thank you, Doc.
Anybody else? And thank you, Karen, for making it happen.
Thank you for having